Dobrý večer, dámy a pánové. Já vás chci srdečně přivítat tady v kině Světozor na tomto dnešním večeru. Moje jméno je Petr Třešňák a připadla mi taková milá povinnost dnešní večer uvádět a jeho část věnovanou diskuzi moderovat. A když jsem poprvé dostal do rukou knihu hosta, kvůli kterému se tadyhle ten večer koná, Breta Stephensona, tak jsem o tom vyprávěl pár lidem a protože jsem novinář, tak jsem si říkal, že bych o tom mohl napsat nějaký článek o výchově kluků. Svěřil jsem se pár známým a kolegům s tím nápadem a bylo zajímavé, že jsem se dočkal dvou typů reakcí. Někteří lidé, když to slyšeli, tak říkali výchova kluku a je s tím nějaký problém, nebo děje se něco? A vůbec vlastně nechápali, proč má cenu se specificky věnovat tématu výchovy chlapců. Ptali se, a je nějaký rozdíl oproti holkám v tom, nebo... A pak byla druhá část lidí, kteří říkali, no tak to je přesně ono, jo. To je důležitý, to je zajímavý. A říkám to vlastně proto, že Breta Stephenson je další z řady autorů, profesionálů, který nám připomínají, že výchova v dnešní době je téma, které se tak trochu učíme znovu. Že hledáme inspiraci jednak v nových vědeckých poznacích a jednak taky ve věcech a principech, postupech, které jsou hodně staré. A kniha Breta Stephensona je v tomto smyslu velice zajímavá. Jsem moc rád, že přijel, že se podařilo ho pozvat do Prahy a bude tady s námi dnešní večer. Vlastně ta jeho návštěva tady se koná díky vydavatelství Dharmagaya, kterého knihu vydalo, a díky občanskému sdružení Diabázis, jež se věnuje tematice psychospirituální krize. A chtěl bych ještě zmínit jména několika organizací, které k němu přispěly k tomu, že ho tady můžeme mít a můžeme tady sedět. A to je teda jednak týdeník Respekt, jež je mediálním partnerem, Liga otevřených mužů a obecně prospěšná společnost Heart. Ještě řeknu něco k tomu, jak vlastně ten večer bude probíhat. My jsme se na Bretovo přání domluvili, že první část by byla věnovaná jeho takové přednášce, nebo vlastně on by povídal o tom, k čemu během mnoha desítek let své praxe a práce s dospívajícími chlapci došel. To bych měl asi zmínit, že jeho specialitou je práce s problematickou mládeží ve Spojených státech. On je transpersonální psycholog a má zkušenost z mnoha zařízení, která se věnují dětem s nějakými problémy ve vývoji a v chování. Potom děláme krátkou přestávku s tím, že bych vás dopředu rád požádal, aby ta přestávka byla pokud možno krátká, aby se nám to neroztahovalo zbytečně, a následovat bude diskuze s několika lidmi, kteří mají různý profesní, osobní vztah k tématu, jemuž je dnešní večer věnován. A tak tím bych asi toto své úvodní slovo uzavřel a pozval Breta na pódium, aby zahájil tady tento večer. Děkuji vám.
Good evening. I have no idea what he said. Was he kind to me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. We're here to talk about teenagers, and particularly, in a few moments, the loss of initiation and rites of passage for modern youth, which are these rituals and ceremonies that have been used for thousands and thousands of years to help teenagers move into adulthood, manhood, womanhood in a healthy way. And what I stumbled into along the way, which will be part of my presentation, is these have gone away in modern times. And basically, almost every culture who is letting go of their old initiatory practices is starting to have teenage problems. And at the forefront of teenage problems is America. We have more teenage drama than all of Europe combined. American teenagers are really in trouble. So I'm really happy to be here because my goal is to just try and help the Czech Republic, who was kind enough to translate my book, and show some interest in this flavor of work to see if we can help you guys keep your teenagers healthy and from going down the wrong road. So, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. By the way, this is St. Matthew, or that's what I call him. That's my nephew, although it's one of the most perfect pictures I ever saw about teenagers. It's in a formerly sacred alcove, which has been totally abused by teenagers with the graffiti and the anarchy signs and the tagging. And Matthew climbed up in there spontaneously and just hit this little praying pose. And for me, it just is so representative of teenagers praying for something better than what surrounds where he's standing. So that's St. Matthew. So if you're not totally sure, initiations and rites of passage are structured ceremonies and rituals that guide usually young adolescents, but teenagers, into adulthood. So they're usually structured and usually designed by the community that the children grow up in. The nice thing about them is they've been designed and used generation after generation after generation after generation. So they've refined these practices. What we're going to talk about tonight are the universal aspects of these, and after the talk, we'll figure out how we can kind of make it fit what the Czech Republic needs. So what these were meant to do is these practices were meant to take a teenager who's trying desperately to become an adult. I mean, if you think about most teen behavior that drives a lot of us crazy, they want to drink, they want to drive cars, they want to have sex, they just want to do all the things grown-ups get to do. The problem is we really don't have any way to let them into the adult club anymore. These practices have gone. So they kind of wander aimlessly. And so they get tired of waiting until they can be told that they're an adult. And a lot of time, as we see, they won't wait and they start doing, behavior we really don't want them to do. So these are why these practices were designed. They were designed to actually move these kids from childhood to adulthood in a hurry. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, sometimes the term rites of passage gets used in a smaller sense than I'm going to talk about tonight. And by that I mean smaller rites of passage, smaller challenges like graduating high school or getting a driver's license. Some people consider those rites of passage, and they are. They're, big moments in a person's life. But mostly what we're going to be talking about tonight is what I consider to be the biggest rite of passage, and that's for a girl to become a woman or for a boy to become a man. So that's the distinction. This is a quote that I ran into a while ago. And it says, "Our youth now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for their elders and love chatter in place of exercise. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up their food, and tyrannize their teachers." Sounds like every teenager I know. This was written by Socrates almost 2,500 years ago. The point is that teenage problems are not new, and I don't even mean teenage problems. Let's just say teenage behavior is not new. It's a process of trying to break out of childhood and move into adulthood. That's the struggle. And so even 2,500 years ago, teenagers are trying to break away from their parents and their families to start their own lives. I imagine everyone in this room went through that process. The problem is most of us just kind of forget it, especially when we become parents. So teens have been teens forever. And we'll talk about some cultures like Africa and the Aborigines of Australia, who have been dealing with teenagers as we know it for 30, 40,000 years. So there's quite a bit of longevity going on here. So the important thing is how you work your kids. But before we really get into the initiation piece, I need to explain kind of how I got to this point in my work with teenagers. Because I spend a lot of time trying to solve problems with teenagers and problem teenagers, the first thing you have to understand is let's make sure we're all on the same page on solving problems. Well, the very first best thing you can do with a problem is, of course, prevent it. If you prevent it, you get to go home, have a beer, life is good, put your feet up and you're done. However, if you can't prevent the problem from manifesting, then you have to do an intervention of some sort. And so you do whatever your intervention is, and if it works, then you get to go home and have a beer and put your feet up. But if your intervention doesn't work, you have to treat the problem. Now, particularly in America, we really like treatment. We do not do much prevention. I'm sorry, I'm going to bash on America a little bit tonight because I can. No, it's kind of like pollution. I mean, we won't put the money into preventing the pollution, but we're really fascinated by the technology and the process and how much money we can spend after the problem happens by trying to fix it when it could have been prevented in the first place. And we all know that treatment is much, much more expensive and takes a whole lot more time and energy and resources than preventing the problem in the first place. You know, a good example of this is I come from Lake Tahoe, a ski resort in California. And a number of years ago, there was a proposal in town to build a juvenile detention center. And I struggled with that. We used to have to take our kids to another part of the county about an hour and a half away. And sometimes in the big snowstorms, nobody really wanted to do that. And so the teenagers knew that they weren't really going to go to juvenile hall in a big snowstorm because the probation officer didn't want to drive in 3 feet of snow. So they got away with a lot of stuff, got their hands slapped, and got sent home. So Lake Tahoe thought it would be really smart if they had their own lockup facility. So for $9 million US, we could lock up 80 of our children. And so I started going to the council meetings and the school board meetings and all the other places I usually get kicked out of. And I was demanding the $9 million to see how many kids I could keep out of the juvenile hall. Let's prevent the problem. Let's take $9 million and see if we can keep these kids from getting locked up. See, this is one of the things that I learned along the way. I started my career at the far end of the treatment scale with kids who were in a final residential treatment center before they were sent to California's youth prison. Their last step before steel bars. That's where I started. And so when I finally started thinking, okay, I need to get these kids a little sooner in their teenager career, I had to try and figure out how do I prevent this problem from starting in the first place? And so I started working on, you know, this kid just needs a mentor, or he needs a tutor, or he needs somebody from the local men's club to take him out and play catch with him, or throw the frisbee, or something like that. Nobody will pay for that. Nobody will pay for prevention. But wait 3 years. Right now, the place I'm working at makes $5,000 per month per teenager. The facility I'm at has 340 kids. Do the math. And it's one of 26 facilities that the company I work for owns. So right now they have 1,500 teenagers at $5,000 a month in these residential treatment centers. Now, if we took all of that money and put it into trying to prevent the problem in the first place, things might be a little better. Okay, so I'm a corporate bailout. Did the Fortune 500 thing, made lots of money, and was really depressed. So I figured I'd go do something that made me sleep better. And somehow I stumbled into these wild things called teenagers. And so the first thing I did was I started looking at these teenagers, and I realized, wow, these kids are really whacked. These kids are really crazy. And that they were the problem because they're bad. They steal. They rob your car. They burglarize your house. These kids are really bad things. And then, of course, after working with them for a little while, I found out what kind of family environment they usually come from. Not always, but mostly. Broken families, poverty, ghettos, things like that. So I decided to get out of treatment, and I worked myself into a counseling agency where I got to get these kids a couple years earlier, hopefully in their career and in their problems. And what I noticed was I was inundated with single boys who were mostly fatherless and lots of single mothers. So my next step were, after I figured out that the parents were the problem, half the problem is most families in America don't have two parents. We're running at a 50% divorce rate. So almost 60% of every kid in America is living with a single mother, which we'll talk about later as a problem from an initiation standpoint. So then I started looking at, wow, parenting is broken, or at least in America. And this is where I got really, really lucky. And my work took a huge turn. Is I got invited to run the teen component at an international youth conference in Ireland. And I got exposed to teenagers from about 25 different countries at that particular workshop. I've since done 6 or 7 more of these, and I've now worked with teenagers from more than 100 countries. And real quickly and simply what I noticed is that the kids that came from the older cultures, Africa, Australia, the Aboriginals, the Polynesians from the Samoa, Tonga, Hawaii. They've even worked once with Eskimos who had never seen dirt because where they lived was always snow. And so working for both of us was really a reality check. And then I had a bunch of California kids who were very entitled, and they had their Nintendos and they had their toys and their distractions. And I started seeing a real difference between the teenagers from the older cultures, who I found much more responsible, much more mature, much more willing to take emotional risks when we were doing workshops and stuff, than were like my classic American California kids who thought everything was lame and stupid and they didn't want to have any part of it. So it sent me off on this huge quest to try and figure out what's going on with parenting in America. And so I started studying parenting everywhere I could. And eventually what I ran into was I was simply looking for, the healthy parenting models to study, and the healthiest ones I could find with the lowest divorce rate and the lowest spouse abuse, and basically no teen problems were the older indigenous cultures. So if we go back to this question of, do we prevent a problem, do we intervene on it, or do we treat it? One of the other things I had to look at is a lot of people where I come from think that teenagers are the cause of a lot of society's problems. The gangs cause a lot of violence, and they do a lot of crime, and they do a lot of graffiti and tag damage, and a lot of drugs, and a lot of that type of stuff. But when I really started thinking about it, are teenagers the cause of society's problems, or is this behavior and this level of dysfunctionality with teenagers, are they the symptom, or are they the outcome of this problem? And that's when I really started shifting what I was thinking about, is teenagers are not the cause of all the problems in our cities. They're the outcome, because we didn't prevent the problem in the first place. So I had to rethink the way I went. And again, this is going back to the juvenile detention mindset, is we're not going to prevent the problem, we're just going to keep locking them up and locking them up. So at this point, I realized at the time, 90% of every kid I had ever worked with was fatherless. He had no dad. And so if I'm going to stop the never-ending flow of teenage boys into my counseling office, What I really needed to work on was the fathering problem. And so I went to the director of my counseling agency and I asked if I could, do some father work. And she said, no, that has nothing to do with what we do here. We're an adolescent counseling agency. I said, yeah, but that's the cause of the problem. And she says, doesn't matter. So I said, okay, how about if on my own time I go try and get some grants and I bring in some money? Can I do some father work? And she said no. And basically she refused to let me work on the cause of the problem. So after about 4 years of continuing to work on the symptoms of the problem, which are 7 kids a day, 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, I realized that's not going to work either. So I had to change directions again. Before we can understand rites of passage, we have to understand what a developmental stage is, or a developmental shift. A developmental shift is this big move or this change that you make in your life. And although we have lots of them, the 7 biggest ones we ever go through, the first thing that ever happens is we're born. And then the second greatest physiological growth spurt that we ever go through is adolescence. It is second only to 0 to 2 years old. I mean, if you think about a baby who's born and can't roll over or do anything, and 2 years later, this kid is walking around, talking a little bit, and just going all kinds of crazy. That is a huge shift in 2 years. And then from 5 to 6, not so much. 8 to 10, not so much. But in adolescence, our bodies go up, our bodies change. It's a huge moment. So that's the second greatest change we ever do. Then typically, after we get through this adolescent problem, we have to go through, next big step is getting married. And then typically the next big step is having children. And then, like for me right now, the stage I'm in is trying to figure out how to do this middle age thing, which is kind of a drag. And then you have to become an elder. And eventually we all have to deal with the biggest developmental challenge of all, which is death. So those are kind of like the 7 big challenges that we all kind of go through. One of the problems that's going on, though, when we talk about this kind of change of parenting, is that right now I did a little research, and I was actually a little amazed that you guys are as close to America as we are. But I looked up a couple studies, and I found out that in a 2005 study, they're estimating 47% of Czech marriages end in divorce, which is almost 50%. So that seems to be a problem that's going on over here also. And then also when I was trying to look at, which I think is really important, unwed mothers, a 2010 study I ran into on the Czech Republic had 41% of your kids born to unwed mothers. Now to some people that doesn't seem like a big deal. But when I grew up, and for people of my generation or my age in the audience, we used to call these illegitimate babies, or worse. And they were completely politically incorrect. And you weren't supposed to do that. I remember when I was about 12 years old in the 60s, this divorced mother moved on to our block, and she had a boy my age. And my father would not let me play with her because she was divorced. And he actually said it like you say cancer, very carefully, and like, she was divorced, and I was not supposed to be around that kid because it might be contagious. So when I was younger, having children out of wedlock, illegitimate, was completely considered inappropriate. We taught it, those were the values that we had, and the values have changed. I can't really tell you where or when or how. When I bring this up in workshops where we have time for people, this is right where people start raising their hands and they go, so what happened to the breakdown of family values? I'm like, I don't know. What do you think we should do about it? And the number one answer I've gotten in 15 years on the question of what has happened to these family values has been the government should do something. Can the government legislate values? No. I mean, you guys know what it's like being told what to do. That didn't go so well. We tried it in America with what was called prohibition, if you've heard of that, in the 20s and 30s when they outlawed alcohol for about 10 or 12 years. That was the government trying to legislate values. It didn't work very well. It created gangs and bootleg liquor. And after they actually brought the alcohol back, we still had the gangs and the violence. No, prohibition didn't prove that all Americans are alcoholics. It just proves that they want the right to be able to do what they want to do, as long as they don't hurt somebody. So this started becoming a pattern and a problem for us to deal with. So now what's changing in these developmental patterns, especially you see with the movie stars, the Angelina Jolies and Madonna and people like that, is now they have children and maybe they get married, maybe they don't. And kids see this. And they live together, and they have children, and they think about getting married, and maybe they will, and maybe they won't. And that is a huge breakdown, considering marriage is absolutely universal across the planet. As far as I know, every culture has invented marriage of some sort. Now, some do it in different ways with more people and some things like that, but basically, all cultures seem to think that we need to have some sort of ceremonial connection between, to create families. And now that we're breaking that apart, I think this is something that's really damaging our children. And it's something that we have to fix as grown-ups. Teenagers can't fix this. Teenagers can't fix a 47% divorce rate. We have to change our values. And we have to put our values back the way they used to be. I don't know how to do it because they just went away so slowly. It was just a little bit here and a little bit there. As a teenager in the 60s, I kind of know how we broke the rules and, we did drugs and we did, hippie stuff and things changed and teenagers, young people started living together and it just never came back. And somehow we need to get it back. One of the other problems I've had in my career, I get, I don't know what you call it, tarred and feathered. I get run out of town a lot when I get to this point, is people talk about how we work with kids, like the therapeutic approaches. And a lot of times people say traditional psychology says, or according to traditional psychology. Well, I have to make the point. I mean, basically traditional new modern psychology started with Freud about 120 years ago. So it's not that old in the scope of the world. And then when you look at the cultures who don't need psychotherapy, who don't need psychoanalysis, who don't need their teenagers in counseling agencies, they've been doing that for thousands of years. So that's what's considered alternative, at least in America. I don't know where you sit here, but in America, thinking like I do puts you out there and out of the mainstream, and they don't like that. So this is a breakdown of the old shamanic or whole person approach, which is mind, body, spirit. In an older culture, the shaman or the medicine person usually wears 3 hats. It's the medical person, the priest, or pastor or minister or something, the religious person, and basically the community therapist or shrink, okay? So when you had any kind of a problem, from a stomach ache to your husband is cheating on you to depression, you went to this person and you never really knew if you were going to get a prayer or a story or an herb, because they work all 3 pieces, mind, body, spirit. And now what we've done in modern times is we've separated that out. And so part of the problem, if you guys are on board with me on we're over-medicating our kids, this is a problem when you take a child's behavior to your medical doctor. Because what can a medical doctor do except do what a medical doctor does, which is usually prescribe something. And the biggest problem, not that that's inherently wrong, because a lot of these medications do serve a purpose, but my point is, nowadays, does your medical doctor and your priest and your teenager's therapist, do they ever get in the same room and talk about what's good for this kid? So we don't get case management and we don't get the mind-body-soul connection. So we've separated out how we work with these kids. And so there's no cohesion. And they get confused because they go to one person who tells them one thing, a priest, and then they go to a therapist who tells them something completely different. And then maybe they go see, the medical doctor who says, oh, I think you need Ritalin, or you need Seroquel, or you need some other psychotropic drug. And there's no wonder that there's no cohesion with these kids. They're completely lost. In America, and I hear it's pretty similar here, we tend to put labels on kids, and also grown-ups. But typically with teenagers, especially when they get in trouble, we love to put labels on them. And the most common one I'm going to use is like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit disorder. These are the kids that are all hyper and can't stay focused for more than a few minutes and things like that. The biggest problem is that one of the things we do is we really look at these kids is whether they have ADHD or not. I mean, you're ADHD, period. That's too black and white for me. And it doesn't leave any room for one, if you're wrong, or if there's anything else going on. I mean, a lot of these kids have more letters after their names than I do. These kids are all PTSD, post-traumatic stress, and they're ADHD, and they have like all kinds of letters after their names. So here's the way I think it's supposed to work. I didn't do this, guys, I swear. I chose the most common name I could pronounce and spell. Peter, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. No, really, to get serious, if we're talking about a teenager, or actually anybody with ADD or any other kind of problem, isn't it really about how much they have? Is somebody simply ADHD or not? Or is it a matter of how much ADHD you have? So, for example, if this Peter has about 12% ADHD, then he's kind of a handful. You have to keep him busy, give him a few things to do, because he doesn't stay focused very well. Not a big deal. But if this other Peter is, say, like 86% on a scale of 1 to 100, is 86% ADHD, now you've got your hands full. This is the kid that drives you crazy and tears up the house. But really, isn't it a matter? It doesn't matter if we're talking bipolar, or how much mother had to drink while she was pregnant, or any of these other disorders. It really comes down to how much. Because we're never just black or white, one thing or the other. Human beings are not that simple. I think one of the problems that modern psychology is doing is just trying to make a science out of human beings. And although you can do that to a point, there's still an art to working with people.